Welcome to the Sword and The Trowel. The Sword and The Trowel is a podcast of Founders Ministries, and Founders exists for the recovery of the gospel and the reformation of the local churches. And I'm Tom Ascol.
And I'm Graham Gunden.
And we're glad to have you join us today, and we're especially glad that you're here today because we have a special guest, Ben Dunson, Dr. Ben Dunson, who is here in Cape Coral at the Institute of Public Theology, teaching a course on political theology this week to our students. And we just finished up the first day, and Ben, thank you so much for joining us here on the Sword and the Trowel.
That's been great.
We're glad to welcome you into this conversation. We want to remind you that if you're intending to go to the annual conference in January of 2023, you need to sign up pretty quickly. Space is filling up quickly. We look forward to having Paul Washer, Vody Balcom, and Joel Beakey with us, along with Bradley Pierce, for that conference as we address the question, what is man? And there's hardly a more relevant subject for us to address right now in American Christianity and American culture as well. Dr. Dunson, you have spent a lot of time thinking about things that we've talked about on this podcast and trying to get our minds around, and then especially this course that you're teaching this week on political theology. But that's not really where you started out in your formal academic studies in terms of theological considerations. So tell us a little bit about how God guided you and then put you together in experience and in your own academic disciplines to bring you to a point where you're interested in teaching public theology.
I've always had a very strong interest in politics. Even when I was a kid, I was very interested in that. I had a grandmother who was also very, very interested in politics, and we would always talk about it when we visit. And I remember just being very interested even in presidential elections as a kid, and that interest stayed with me throughout life. I studied political science as an undergrad at our institution at Texas A&M.
Texas A&M, that's right.
And that was unfortunately not very enjoyable because the study of politics there was very much statistics and very centered on trying to think of politics as a science, and so it was very light on political philosophy and political history. That's what I wanted to study. Yeah. So it was disappointing.
So what was your first election that you actually got to cast a ballot?
The first time I ever voted was George Bush Jr., the first time he ran.
Okay.
So
you were in college, I guess, at the time?
Yeah, I let's see, when was that election? Now I can't even
2000.
remember. Yeah, 2000. Wow. So yeah, I was right in the middle of my time at A&M.
Yeah.
I think I might have just missed the previous election.
Okay. My first election was 1976, and I voted for Jimmy Carter because he was a good Southern Baptist.
All right.
I spent 4 years regretting it.
That's even worse than my first election, voting for Mitt Romney.
Oh, did you? Well, nevertheless. It was funny because my political science professor that year at A&M was saying that once Carter was elected, all of his friends from the Northeast were calling and saying, what is born again? What is born again? They didn't have an idea. So, all right, you graduated with a poli-sci degree
I
from
did,
A&M,
yeah.
is that right?
Mm-hmm,
so what did you do
right.
after that?
You know, I was a little bit aimless for a year. I wasn't really sure what to do, and I had a sense that I wanted to be in ministry in some way. I wasn't really sure. So I took a year off and then decided I wanted to go to seminary. I was still a little clueless because at that time I was deciding between Westminster and Dallas Seminary. And my college pastor is hearing me say this and realizing that he must not know enough about the differences to even realize that that's a pretty radical difference between the two of them. So I learned a little bit more in that year and realized Westminster was the place. And
went in Philadelphia? In
Philadelphia, yeah. And I had a growing sense for a call to ministry, but it was still a little bit hazy for a while. But then I went there to study.
And then after Westminster?
After Westminster, I moved to England. So I got married after my first year of seminary. And we had our first son towards the end of that time, and then we moved to Durham, England, in the northeast of England. Yeah. And I did my doctorate at the University of Durham in New Testament. So we were there for 3 years.
So from New Testament, from political science bachelor's to an MDiv, I guess, at Westminster?
Yeah, well, I did an MAR and a THM.
Okay.
Yeah. at Westminster.
And then you go to Durham and New Testament, and now you're teaching political theology.
Yeah, it's been a wild ride. I've just had that interest, even in studying New Testament. I've had an interest in issues that I think are related to the Christian's place in the world, and thinking through what it means to live in a world where we've got to make these kind of decisions about politics and things like that. So I've had that interest, maybe below the surface a bit. It's been recently, though, that I've been able to really kick that into high gear with American Reformer and so on.
Yeah, well, I got introduced to you through Graham because, Graham, you were a student of Dr. Dunson's at Reformation Bible College, right?
Yes, that's right.
So, I mean, what all did you take from
Oh, man.
there?
I probably took 8 or 9 classes from you.
I taught a lot of classes there.
We were just talking about Theology of Paul, having to read Herman Ritterboss as a freshman in Bible college. Took all my Greek classes from you, four Greek classes. Threatened with a Roman gladius sword in those Greek classes. Actually, Dr. Dunson was probably the single influence that kept me from becoming a libertarian in college. It was, all the rage to become a libertarian. Who needs government anyway, right?
Yeah.
And I just remember one day in the kitchen drinking coffee, you're like, libertarians aren't conservative. And I had never even thought of that. Libertarians aren't conservative. Maybe we can discuss that today.
Yeah.
Well, very good. Yeah, and I remember you've been at American Reformer now for a little over a year, 2 years?
Yeah, so we launched last summer. We were kind of doing the initial work over the year before that to get it ready.
Yeah, well, I guess, Graham, you may have told me about it first, but I started reading the things that you put out there, which, by the way, if you're not familiar with American Reformer, you definitely got to go. There's AmericanReformer.com, is that
.org,
.org, yeah. And there's just a wealth, it's a growing wealth of resources there to think theologically about culture, life, the key issues of the day. I just appreciate the good work that you're doing.
Thank you.
So what led you to be involved in that effort?
Well, a lot of things. One was a friendship in Dallas with Nate Fisher, who's our founder, one of our founders, and he's a businessman and investor in Dallas, and we had a lot of common interests. We went to church together, and we had become friends, and we began talking about education. That was kind of what got it started, I think, was we both had a strong interest in education and higher education. And then one thing led to another. We started talking about just the pressing needs of the day and realizing that there's a lot of good resources out there for thinking about culture, maybe even politics and things, but there isn't as much from a kind of classically Protestant perspective, just getting people thinking about it and getting in touch even with some older authors in that tradition and seeing ways that we can apply them today. And we both had an interest in that, so we started talking about the possibility of a publication that would emphasize that. But he also had a very strong interest in something that would be aligned with a kind of activism component, right? That's dealing with trying to change institutions, right? Not just talking and not just writing, but also being oriented towards actual change for the better in different organizations.
Yeah. Well, very interesting. So I'm interested in your take on what's going on in American evangelicalism broadly, and then any kind of smaller segments of that you might be familiar with regard to these kinds of concerns, the concerns of public or political theology. What do you see?
I mean, I see that a lot of Christians are active politically, but maybe some of them haven't really thought about it that much, right? It's kind of instinctual or just responding to the issue of the day. So I see that to some degree. On the other side, there's a very strong trend towards trying to tell Christians that they shouldn't be involved in politics, that politics itself it's unspiritual. It's going to lead them away from faithfulness to Christ. That it's beneath them. It maybe will even defile them, or it's just we've heard that, right? It's dirty business. It's a necessary evil at best, but maybe not even that. And so I felt like there's a lot of maybe confusion about that, primarily because people are saying that, they're saying you can't be involved, you're not a faithful Christian if you are. So a lot of people are impacted by that, and they think, oh man, I guess I can't care about these sort of things. I need to just only deal with what they're telling me is spiritual. And so we wanted to be a place that shows people that if you think about politics rightly, if you can kind of transcend this idea of just partisan infighting and all that, that's not exactly the core of politics, that politics is about how humans organize themselves in society, and how to do that justly and rightly. And maybe we've all heard people disparaging power lately, right? Just the idea that if you seek power, that's evil. But what if it's the case that power is inherent to government, and we should have a righteous exercise of power? We should seek that as Christians, and trying to help people see those sorts of things, because I think there's a lot of confusion about that.
Yeah, it seems as though there's also kind of a pessimism or a defeatism that when Christians think about government, well, certainly we can think about the utopia, pie in the sky vision for what we would do, but Christians will never be in control of government. Christians will never really be able to have an effect. It'll always be secularists or pagans who are the civil magistrates. So what we need to do is we need to figure out how to live as a church under people who are not Christians. And so it's just like, why even bother trying to figure out a political theory or political philosophy? Have you seen that?
Oh, yeah. It's making peace with the kind of secular settlement, right? That you keep your private values to yourself, and that's fine if that's what you believe, although that's increasingly not even true. And keep it out of the public sphere, the public realm. You see that all over the place. I think a lot of Christians are confused about that as well.
I do fear that that's one of the, perhaps one of the effects of a bad Baptist political theory, is because we've always kind of been on the outskirts, and even in our own founding, is that, we're never going to be there. We're never going to be the ones with power. So how do we then live in light of that, and never actually thinking about, okay, well, how do we gain power so that we can exercise it justly?
Yeah, and even thinking about that becomes like an indictment against your core profession and what God's called you to be. And one of the things we've been trying to stand against as we got our minds around the last several years is this subjective pietism. Thinking that holiness is wrapped up exclusively in me and God. Me and Jesus, what I do in my quiet time, what I do in my private life, and this whole public demeanor out there. Well, somehow that's not to be a concern of a real Christian, certainly not of the church. And so we just kind of let that go, which is crazy if Jesus Christ is Lord. He's Lord over everything, right? Yeah. So why do you think, give the best construction that you can, and then let's try to maybe drill down and be a little more realistic. Why do you think so many evangelical leaders over the last several years have been sounding this drum, this warning, beware of politics, don't get engaged in politics, it's dirty and you shouldn't do that. And they point out the worst case examples of Christians who fall into bad patterns, thinking and acting politically. What do you think that is motivating that? What's driving that? What are the real concerns there?
I think there are a lot. I think some are just trying to make peace with defeat, right? That we haven't been that successful, maybe we haven't been that good at it, and so let's just come up with a rationale for why we should always accept that. I think there are some that are probably not entirely honest, right? They're actually saying, you guys give up power. The people we don't like, the people that if they had power would do things that we don't like. And they're saying Christians should give up power. So when they convince you to give up your power, they're not exactly giving up their power, right? They're taking positions where they're called public theologians and things like that. It's like, well, they're actually seeking quite a bit of power, and they're seeking to influence government and these things, but they want to do it in a different way. And if you can convince your opponents to stop seeking power, and you're the only one seeking power, that's pretty convenient for you. But not everyone's that cynical, certainly. Right.
Yeah. Either you guys, or you probably wouldn't, you might. You ever hear of Justice Sunday? You remember the Justice Sunday movement years ago?
I haven't heard of that.
Maybe about 15 years ago or so. And man, I saw this coming in, and I wrote against it. I thought, this is crazy. It was basically draping the flag over the Bible, and having Sunday services. There was Justice Sunday services, and churches were being encouraged to just stand up for America and all. And I recoiled against that. I still recoil against that. But looking back on it, I think, well, okay. I mean, they were trying to do something. They were just misguided because there wasn't a rigorous, in my estimation, thoughtful kind of theological foundation for thinking about political issues as well as other public issues. So in retrospect, I haven't gone back and read some of the things I wrote, but I probably would chasten myself today based upon what I saw then as just a complete capitulation to partisan politics, and recognize, well, wait a minute, there's a good impetus in this. It was just misguided and hijacked in bad ways, which is all the more a call for doing what we're trying to do in the Institute of Public Theology, and particularly with this course on political theology.
Yeah, it's interesting that's what I think. What most people, when they talk about Christian nationalism, is that's what comes to mind. Draping the flag over the Bible. And then you get people on the other side who are saying, I'm a Christian nationalist, but what that means is that I'm a nationalist as opposed to an imperialist or a globalist or a feudalist, and I want my nation to be explicitly Christian. And so you get these arguments going back and forth. People are just talking past each other.
Yeah. So, Dr. Dunson, are you a Christian nationalist?
Yeah, I still kind of recoil from that term, but the reason is not because I care if someone calls me a Christian nationalist. And just like Graham said, right, the political vision that I would articulate, I'm certain that the people who don't like what they call Christian nationalism would call it Christian nationalism. Right. I was trying to think about why I still don't like that term, and I thought about even some recent things that have happened in Florida, where Ron DeSantis removed the prosecutor, and you were commenting on that recently, because he said he wouldn't enforce Roe versus Wade. And I thought, that's exactly how government should be operating, right? You should be seeking justice. We know what justice is as Christians, and you should be seeking to do that. But I thought, what would happen if Ron DeSantis said, I'm a Christian nationalist, and I'm removing this man out of my biblical obligation to do X, Y, or Z? I have a sense it would go differently. Maybe that's just because we live in a secular world and we need to challenge that. But I would rather see it happen than see it thwarted because of trying to argue for a specific label that is going to turn other Christians off even. So it's really pragmatic for me. It's really a matter of strategy. I think so. I don't care if someone calls me a Christian nationalist. I know most of the time people say that, they use that phrase. They're just using it as a way to say these people are horrible, Christians who are going to do horrible things to us.
Yeah, and it's there's two or three different fronts in my own mind about this, because even trying to address some of the things we've been addressing the last few years through founders, there are folks say, well, you're just nothing but theonomists. You want a theocracy. You want to bring in the Old Testament case laws again and apply them with full authority as if they were still in force for everyone everywhere. And you're not a theonomist.
No.
Right? Yeah. So how do you think in terms Christianly, wanting to see Christianity prevail, wanting to see politics and our lives together in nation states come under the right influence of Jesus Christ as Lord, without falling into the theonomy or theocracy advocates?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's actually looking at the law itself and just recognizing that there were aspects of the law that are very specifically centered on Israel's life as a nation in the land that can't be transferable. Yeah. I think that's the simplest answer to that. But it's also recognizing that the law had certain moral principles, that a certain moral bedrock. I mean, Christians have recognized this well before the rise of theonomy.
Yeah.
It's a classic Christian view that the Ten Commandments are a reflection of the basic natural law, which natural law is nothing other than just God's timeless moral law. And so I see that, and Christians have seen that historically as a necessary bedrock for a healthy society. And I support that. And I think the law itself makes it clear that there are certain dimensions including even certain aspects of the civil enforcement that were restricted to Israel's time in the land. And so we shouldn't try to reinstate those.
Yeah. Our confession, I think the Westminster also talks about general equity, doesn't it? You know, it's certainly there in the 1689 confession. And I've seen that. I've recently been reading John Dagg, who was the first writing theologian among Baptists in the South in the 19th century. And he's got books that are better known, but one book is not so well known. It's called Elements of Moral Science, which is an ethics book for him. And I was just struck by the number of times that he is appealing to Old Testament case law. You know, it's not because he's trying to implement it and say, okay, this is what we've got to do here in the United States of America, but he is demonstrating what the confession says about looking and seeing where the general equity lies in those case laws that are applicable for us today, and how we should try to order our lives in the best way together in a nation state. And I mean, we need to be doing that. We haven't done that very well, at least in our Baptist circles over, I don't know, at least a few generations here.
Yeah. So I have an interesting question for you. I mean, we can talk about the Christian's role in politics and in culture and all that, but what would you say the church's role in politics should be?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think there's a lot of confusion about that in particular. You know, we have we live in America where a lot of people think that Thomas Jefferson's claim about separation of church and state, the absolute wall of separation, they think that's in the Constitution. So we sort of have an uphill battle. I mean, he was in the minority in holding that view at that time. Like, that was a radical view at the time. He and Madison spoke in that kind of way, but very few other people at that time in America did, including our leaders.
Right.
And so, I mean, one thing I like to show people is just go back to America's past, and you'll see that that's not even common for Americans, including our founding fathers, to think in terms of that absolute separation. But it is very important to distinguish the work of the church from the work of Christians serving in politics or things like that. So we have to make that distinction. The vocation of the pastor is very different than the vocation of the politician. They're both legitimate and valid vocations, but they're different, and they have different things that they focus on. But we don't want to radically separate that either. And what's the job of the church? Well, the job of the church is to preach the gospel, but it's the whole gospel. It's the whole Christ, right? Christ for justification, Christ for sanctification. And that's going to be shaping God's people, right? It's going to be equipping them to go out and serve in different vocations. So if they go out to serve politically, or even if it's not as a politician, even if it's just simply to see you could get more active in your local community, maybe in local politics or state politics or something like that. If you're able to do that, that's a good thing. The church should encourage that, and it should equip the people of God to go out and serve that way, and to do that joyfully, without guilt, thinking that somehow this isn't a spiritual thing, you know, that I'm somehow getting my hands dirty in this. Even just basic moral formation. How are they going to be equipped to serve politically themselves, or to vote or anything if they're not morally formed, especially in a very chaotic moral environment like that now?
It's Patrick Henry argued for that the government would pay ministers and provide for the needs of ministers, and of course most of the states and then the federal government did not do that, but he had a view, not necessarily of separation of church and state as Madison or Jefferson did, but he had a view of a distinction, even with the government paying ministers, a distinction between church and state. And I'm not advocating that the government should pay ministers either, but that distinction, I think, is a helpful one to never lose that. Though the church may get involved in politics in some way, and Christians may get involved in politics in some way, there still will always be a distinction. There still will always be an exercise of the keys by the church and an exercise of the sword by the civil magistrate.
Yeah, and as a Baptist growing up, I remember that separation of church and state, and the Danbury Baptist Association and the letter that was written. And, you know, that was a kind of a high watermark for us as Baptists to look back on and say, oh, this was our great contribution. And, you know, I can appreciate it even now. That there is a a separation. There ought to be a separation between church and state,
Yeah.
but not between Christ and state. I mean, Christ is Lord over everything, and so the state is obligated to Christ. Governors, presidents, senators, everyone is obligated to Christ, and that makes some in our circles nervous when you say that. They immediately hear, oh, theocracy.
Right.
But no, Christ doesn't intend for the church to be the state or the state to be the church. There is a difference between them, but he's Lord over both, and both owe him complete obedience and submission and following after what he's prescribed for them to do, which is different. So as we've already said.
So in your mind, then, what is, for a Christian who wants to be engaged in politics, what is the purpose of politics? And then why would a Christian want to be engaged in politics?
Yeah, the purpose of politics is to order a society rightly. It's to administer justice in the world. The state exists to punish evil, exists to promote that which is good and to praise that which is good. It exists for the well-being of the people under its authority. Right? Those are all inherently good things. And if you put it in those terms, I think Christians can see that, right? Is that the state exists for those purposes. And who wouldn't want to be involved in some way? Now, everyone doesn't need to devote themselves to politics. Everyone doesn't need to be a politician. Some people can devote more time than others to that. But you can at least see it as an inherently good thing. And even power, or even the exercise of political power, it's either going to be done unrighteously or righteously. It's going to be done good, or it's going to be done well, or it's going to be done badly. And we want to see it done well. And we should encourage Christians to promote that and not be afraid of that.
So then in your mind, what is the ideal political regime?
Yeah, the ideal. So I mean, that's a very interesting discussion in Protestant political thought. They kind of carry over the old discussions in Plato and Aristotle, Cicero, where they look at the benefits and the drawbacks of democracy, the benefits and drawbacks of monarchy, the benefits and drawbacks of something like oligarchy, and they can see that there are benefits to each potentially. But there are possibly drawbacks to each, and I think they would all recognize that it's not a one-size-fits-all sort of thing. And that's the impression I get in older Protestant thinkers as well. I mean, most of them live in a context where they either live under a king or they live in a kind of city-state environment like Calvin and Geneva, where there's the local magistrates who rule. And they don't argue that we need to overthrow these regimes because they're not the one true perfect form of government. They argue that you can operate in many different kinds of political system righteously as a Christian, and you can actually see justice administered. You can see a right political ordering in many different kinds of states. And so they're not actually that concerned usually to say it has to be one or the other. If it's a monarchy, then they're going to be concerned to say there need to be ways in which lower officials can check someone who becomes a tyrant as a monarch. But they don't say that monarchy is inherently illegitimate. And that's really how I feel too, is that despite the rhetoric that we've heard for a long time, that democracy is the only legitimate form of government, I think you can have a righteous democracy. I mean, if the people are voting well, if they're putting good people into power, it's always healthy to have the people having some sense that they have some control over those who are over them. I think that's possible even in a monarchy. I think that's healthy, but I don't think you have to insist on that. So the short answer is Christians can operate righteously in many forms of government. Is there a more ideal form? I think it's more what is government doing rather than what is the form that matters most. Is it actually exercising justice? Is it punishing evil? Is it promoting the good? Is it seeking to honor God in those ways?
In America, we have such an incredible opportunity that God's blessed us with over the history of our nation, and it's been easy to take it for granted. And that's what happened to me. I talked to a man I've known for a while who's on the other side of some of these issues with me on in terms of social justice, wokeness, and whatever. And we talked a few years ago, and he said one of the things as he's become more kind of involved in that has happened to him is he realized he was valuing his American citizenship too much, which was interesting. I said, well, one of the things that's happened to me is I realized I had not valued it nearly enough. Now, certainly citizenship in heaven is right. That's triumphant over everything. That's primary. But God has done something in this nation that is incredible. And if you just look at it from a purely pragmatic standpoint, I mean, we send the gospel around the world. We give, we help. This nation in its history, with all of its flaws, grant the critics everything they want to say about that, nevertheless has done incredible good for the world. And it's done so because of the Christian impact, the power of the gospel that was working even in deists like Jefferson. I'm struck by the fact that Jefferson wanted the emblem of the nation to be Pharaoh, being wiped out in the Red Sea. I mean, this is a deist.
Yeah.
Give me deists like that today. I would love to have that. And so if that's true, if God has done that in this nation and there's been so much good, why in the world would we just sit by and squander it? Not pretending that we're want a church state or a state church, but as the church trying to teach those people whom we see become disciples to observe everything that Jesus has commanded, which includes thinking righteously about government and the state. So I am very hopeful that there will be a backlash. I hope we're a part of it, of what we've seen for many, many years now with Christians who are saying, no, we need to think more carefully and deeply about these things and recover something of our heritage that in at least a majority of my pastoral life, I just didn't think deeply enough about. And I appreciate what you're doing at the American Reformer in resourcing that type of effort.
Yeah, I do think that there is a backlash. I think as we see the rise of neo-Marxism, people, Yoram Hazony talks about this, people who have been previously liberals are seeing the way that liberalism is not sufficient to fight Marxism. And so they're going over to conservatism, but conservatism in the West is rooted in the Christian tradition.
That's right.
And so you can't get too far into political conservatism without seeing the law and the gospel in the scriptures. So I do see that as a hopeful sign. I do see it as an opportunity that the church has now.
Amen. Amen. Well, Ben, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
We're grateful for your work, and we'll pray that God will continue to prosper it.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us today on the Sword and the Trowel.